On the approach to 15 years abroad, thinking back on things, and especially meeting so many people who are just getting abroad for the first time in their lives, there are things that I'm coming to realize that I remember were big shocks for me at one point, but now all of these years later, I barely bat an eyelash. And so in this episode, I wanted to go over some of the things now that I know some people still find surprising, but for me it's just become kind of part of regular everyday life. So let's just get started and roll that intro. Hello there, I'm Rafael de Furia, back at it again for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. And so, just to get straight into things, the first thing, and while standing on the street here, there could be, at some point, somebody who might walk by, and maybe nobody's gonna walk by, but smoking. That is one thing that I remember at one point, it used to feel like it invaded my nostrils, and that everywhere you want. Things have gotten better since I first left America, and I've been back and forth to Europe in different places, but really the focus is more thinking about kind of things from the perspective of Europe. But still, I know for a lot of Americans, coming even to a place like Portugal, and even here, the amount of people that smoke isn't as bad as some places as I've seen, but it can be a lot for some people, like that there's not separate smoking sections and not different places where those evil smokers have to go and do their thing. There are some people who are very respectful of others and do try to stand off to the side, but even just like, actually, I'm gonna just turn the camera around just over. There's a cafe down at the end of the block there, and over there, even just a regular cafe, you'll sometimes have people who will sit down. And I'm not saying specifically there, but I'm saying like it could be anywhere that a person might sit down and they just start smoking, and it's not that big of a deal. It's just kind of normal. People don't complain about that unless it's like all the smoke is blowing right in their face, but even then, it's kind of an accepted part of life. Another thing that no longer phases me, but still can definitely get on my nerves from time to time, definitely has to be bureaucracy. This is going to be something that you will have to get used to. But having moved here to Portugal from Italy, I can say that for me, bureaucracy is a lot less of a headache here than what I've dealt with or seen or heard of from Italy. I mean, don't get me wrong, Italy can be an amazing place, but as I've joked about many times about how in Italy, soccer is probably the biggest pastime, the biggest sport, bureaucracy is probably number 2. But the one thing that maybe would surprise me, or maybe, I don't want to say phase, but would definitely make me kind of just take a step back, is when bureaucracy goes well, when things happen fast, when you have to sign up for something, when all of the pieces just fall into place, that is almost more of a surprise. And I can say I've had quite a few of those experiences in Portugal, like with my internet taking just a matter of days to get signed up. I think I've mentioned this in the podcast before about how when I went to sign up, the guy said, "Oh, I'm sorry, it could take quite some time before we're able to get out to your place." I was like, how long are we talking about? And having been in Italy, knowing that it can take a few weeks or a couple of weeks, and in a really extreme situation, maybe more, when he responded to me that, oh, it's going to take a while, and yeah, it could probably be a few days before they get out there, a couple of days, I was more than happy with that. That was totally fine once the ball got rolling. But to get that ball rolling to that point, there were a lot of hoops to jump through before, having to get the tax code and the this and the that and everything set up just the right way, so all the papers were in order so that I could get that going. Definitely doable, although getting phone lines and stuff like that set up, I'm not going to say is not necessarily less of a nightmare in a different country, even the US, for example. But when you're having to deal with paperwork and so on, definitely be prepared, definitely be ready for having a bit of a headache. Like just make sure that you keep your expectations realistic. Something else that no longer phases me and potentially can be annoying though, is that in August, a lot of Europe, especially Southern Europe, like shuts down or things happen slower because everybody's on vacation. That is the time of year that everybody just goes out and they do their own thing. They have their own time away from work, and everybody takes vacation at the same time. So if you are going to be traveling to Europe, August actually is a good time to avoid. If you're living here in Europe, personally, I would have the preference if I could push my vacation a little bit after August and even mid-September, things are going to be a lot quieter. It, in some places, will have the tourist season be over, and so maybe things won't be as open. But when you're living in this part of the world and not being able to get certain things done when you really, really need them, definitely can be annoying. But again, at this point in my life, it's just expected. If I need to get something done, I either have to get it done in July or in September. But to keep moving on with the list, and of course this list is in no particular order of any kind, but another thing, and actually maybe, I don't know if you could hear the background, some bottles and cans clanking around, but a lot of places serve alcohol in Europe and don't necessarily, depending on the country of course, but a lot of places might not even need a liquor license to be able to serve alcohol. Like, it doesn't matter, you could go to a bakery, you could go to a cafe, bar, but of course you expect it at a bar, but even if you have like a, I don't know, a kebab stand on the corner, you can get beers there. McDonald's, Burger King, it's not unusual to be able to find beer at those types of places, and or even wine. Some places that you would never even imagine would have alcohol in the US, at least the equivalent sort of place in Europe, definitely can happen. Again though, of course, it depends on what country you're in. But another part of living abroad in Europe that really you have to get used to, how often there can be train strikes or any type of public transportation strike, especially. Those are going to be the ones that you'll have that might interrupt your life a bit more. But the good thing about those is, generally speaking, in a lot of places, of course it depends on what country you're in, but there will be announcecements ahead of time. So let's say it's a train strike that's coming up, and maybe the train company that will be affected is going to actually have a website, or page on their website rather, that will have all the disruptions that they're expecting for these scheduled strikes. It's not just that people just walk out. I mean, I'll admit sometimes I do wonder, is it a strike? Is it a real strike? Or are they just wanting a day off? I'm probably wrong about that, but I do have my moments where I wonder when there's some strikes that just come out of nowhere. But it is interesting to see, and it can happen with buses, it can happen with taxis, it can happen with anything. So again, it's going to be one of those things that you'll just have to expect can happen. Not that it's going to happen all the time, but in some parts of Europe it might feel like it. Another thing that for people coming from outside of Europe can find a bit surprising and sometimes off-putting is when you go and you have to sit at a restaurant that you'll actually have to pay for the table. Depending on what country you're in and how that's all handled, things can change a bit. Like, for example, in Italy, you're technically paying for a clean tablecloth and the cutlery. I mean, to me, that just should be a given. But whatever, it's how it's kind of perceived and how it's done. It's a cultural thing. I won't argue with it, even though I may have argued with it once or twice in my time. But here in Portugal, for example, it's done a little bit differently. And what you can do is when they bring like it's like couvert or cover charge, and sometimes even in Italy it'll include, say, like a little bit of bread and some olives. There will be times though, like when you can go, especially like in the Veneto, that you can get like an aperitivo, like a special aperitivo hour, and they'll bring you sandwiches, or you'll have a buffet where you can grab like snacks and stuff, and there's no like real extra charge for that. But some places, like I was saying before, if you're sitting at like a restaurant and there's the tablecloth and everything there, you might have that cover charge here in Portugal also. But one thing that I've noticed, and I mentioned this in a previous episode, that you can actually refuse the bread and olives or whatever, or even sometimes cheese that they bring out. And in some cases you won't be charged, some cases you will be charged, but I've seen personally that I've experienced more cases where I haven't been charged when I haven't wanted the bread or anything like that. So that's something to keep in mind. But in Italy, if they do bring you bread and all that stuff, you still may get charged the cover charge for the table and tablecloth. But I know one big thing when people move to Europe that they think about is that they're going to be able to travel and they're going to be able to go from place to place to place to place. And one thing that I find really cool, especially for people who are dual citizens, or not necessarily for people who have visas to be in Europe, but whatever, it can work a little bit differently, but to have the ability to travel internationally but feel like it's domestic. Let me explain what I mean. So I am an Italian citizen. I'm here and living in Portugal as an Italian citizen. If I want to travel around Europe, theoretically I can use my Italian ID card. I could use my passport, and I will still generally bring my passport along with me. But theoretically, if I had to go to, say, Spain, maybe let's say 30, 40 minutes to the border, and then to get to Vigo, the city, kind of the next largest city that's close to Portugal, we're talking about an hour, roughly, hour and a half probably. And technically, I don't need anything more than just my ID to go there. And yeah, for if you're not a European citizen, you're just an American, bring your passport, keep it in your pocket, but more than likely nobody's going to check anything. And even to get, if you're traveling by air, you're not going to have passport control. It's like I said, almost like flying on a domestic flight where you go, you check in. If you check in, I mean, if you do electronic check-in, I would definitely recommend that. I'll explain why in a second. But say you do your check-in, whether it's electronic or up at the gate, then you just go up to the security and you just show them. They're not checking like to see dates or this or that or the other. What they're doing is just to make sure that the name on the ID matches the name on the ticket. And then from there, you just get onto the flight, basically. Okay, they'll check your ID and ticket one more time, but still, you're not gonna have to get stamped. You're not gonna have to wait in those huge lines like you would have if you're coming in or out of the European Union or most countries around the world where you have those immigration lines that you have to go through. In Europe, it's all really streamlined and very convenient to get through. Whether you're a European citizen or not, if you're flying within the European Union, if you are a European or a citizen of a European country, then it makes that even that one little bit more convenient on top of something that's already quite convenient to begin with. But one of the reasons why I really do recommend to check in electronically online before your flight and not at the airport is that there are some airlines that will charge you extra, and I'm sure this is happening in other parts of the world as well, but just in case that maybe you're not familiar with things out here, that they may charge you on some airlines. And I think maybe Ryanair is one of them, maybe EasyJet, like some of the budget carriers, which are barely budget anymore. I mean, okay, they still have budget flights, but in comparison to what flights were, I'm not going to get into that in this episode. But talking about budget and ways of saving money, worthwhile checking in ahead of time so that you don't have that fee. And especially if you have extra luggage and overweight luggage, something that I experienced once when I was doing an international move was I had a flight and I had to get there early because as someone offered to take me there, and everything was just whatever. I got there way too early, but I was sitting at the airport and I was saying, I wonder how much the extra luggage will cost. Maybe I should have an idea just so that I have everything planned out for the right card, that I do everything, or do I have enough cash with me? Which I definitely didn't have enough cash with me at the time, thinking about it now. But basically, in the end, it was like half of the price if I pre-purchased the extra luggage before, rather than doing everything at the check-in stand. So I was at the airport on my phone, I paid for everything, and then 5 minutes later I was in line dropping it off with them. So it actually made the check-in process a little bit faster, and on top, I saved hundreds. And I'm not joking, I had a lot of luggage with me. And that's also why I didn't have all the cash on me, because I knew it was going to be pricey, but because there was a mix-up between the travel agent and the website, whatever, I won't go into it, but really, it can save you so much money. Another thing that I would say really to get used to, especially if you're going to be in Southern Europe, if you're in Central and Northern Europe, it could be a little different. But when you're meeting with friends, especially in social situations, but sometimes even for professional meetings and so on, do not be surprised if the person that you're going to be meeting with is coming late. I mean, I had friends in Italy that I would go and meet up with, and I knew not to be there until at least a half an hour late, because I knew they wouldn't be there until half an hour or more late. That's just something that I had to keep in mind with some of my friends, not all of my friends, but of course when you're hanging out, like say with expats or anything, like most people kind of, if they say the time, like if you're coming from like say the States, most Americans are pretty on time, maybe a few minutes late, but like half an hour or more late, yeah, that can be a little bit different for some people to get used to. But I'm not saying this is everybody, and I'm not necessarily generalizing, but generally speaking, and I'm not going to say like, oh, people are going to be a half an hour late all the time, but what I will say is that things can happen a little bit later than maybe what they were originally planned for. Not all the time, but be prepared. Another thing though that I remembered hearing growing up all the time was the food in Europe, the quality, it's just très magnifique, it's amazing, it's the best in the world, they don't use the chemicals, they don't the this and the produce and the bread. It really is a mixed bag, and I'm going to say, if you want food chock full of chemicals that are over processed and breads that are white as snow, you'll find them. It's not going to be hard. And I would say as time goes on, even what I've seen, that like even since coming to Europe as a kid, I've seen it at different points, and each time I come, especially to see how much more Americanized certain things are, like certain products, and more processed. And even like when we're talking about, say, organic vegetables, I stopped buying organic vegetables a while ago. I mean, already a few years at least at this point, because my experience was that when I would go looking for organic vegetables, was that most of what was in the store, like at a health food store, was already rotten, or it tasted horrible, disgusting. I was shocked by that. And then I started experimenting by going to regular supermarkets for the vegetables. Like, vegetables were always one thing that, just growing up, also tried to get them organic, just tried to get them like as fresh as possible. Depending on where you are in Europe, you can sometimes make arrangements with like farmers and stuff, and you get like a box for a flat rate, like every week, every 2 weeks. I mean, this is not unheard of. But if we're talking about like going to a health food store or a supermarket nowadays, I hate to say it, but for the most part, if I'm wanting to get vegetables, I will get them from a supermarket. And I will say though, that the one kind of upside is that now a lot of supermarkets, not everywhere of course, but a lot of supermarkets do seem to be doing more produce that's actually organic, and even dry products throughout the stores. Not that it's going to be a huge selection, but there are going to be places, like even here in Braga, there's one supermarket in particular that I can think of that, like, they have one section in the supermarket that's organic products, organic fresh and this and that. And it's almost the size of a whole store, like a whole small little health food store that you would find in Europe, just inside of the supermarket. I mean, in a way, it's sad to see that some of these smaller health food stores are having a hard time competing, but unfortunately it's hard to compete with fresh fruits and vegetables. And I will say that even I've been able to get some fresh fruits and vegetables, well, fresh-ish, that, well, at least they're not rotten. I'll say that much. And so that's been really nice to have that big difference there from what I was experiencing so many times, where I'd buy it and it was either already just on the shelf, just completely rotten, or even by the time I got home, it was just inedible. So even though you can find really good quality food, don't expect everything here to be perfect, even though many people may have promised that it is the promised land of wonderful fruits and veg and products, baked goods and so on. Okay, baked goods, that's a different story. Not everything is perfect, and just like anywhere else in the world, you have the good stuff, you have the bad stuff. And also, when you are in Europe, I mean, I can say it is worth keeping in mind to go to local bakeries. Sometimes you will find gourmet bakeries where things are ridiculously overpriced, but if you're just going to kind of a regular place, depending on where you are, you can probably get some good fresh breads for a very fair price. I'm not going to say that's everywhere, but worthwhile keeping an eye out if you do eat a lot of bread. Personally, I don't eat a ton, so it's not something that I always keep an eye out for. But even here in Braga, if I want, say, a sourdough, which is very hard to find in general in Southern Europe, I know where to go to. Like, it's worthwhile just making sure that you have a good idea of everything around you. This is why I always say it's so important to do your own research for where you're going to find the things, because even, say, if you're coming to Braga, and I'm not trying to sell Braga, that's never been my intention of any sort, or to sell any place that I've ever lived. It's to talk about some of the realities and some of the wonderful things and not wonderful things about there. But one thing I can say about being here in Braga is that you do have some really interesting choices for different bakeries and fresh goods. With this last topic, though, that I want to get into, normally I don't talk about this sort of stuff, but what can be really odd for some people coming from other parts of the world, depending on where you're from, but when you're taking a public train and you're at a train station, it's not uncommon that if you have to go to the bathroom, that you'll actually have to pay for it. So it's always worthwhile carrying coins with you. And so this is another thing that I will say, depends on what part of Europe you're in. There are going to be some parts of Europe where things are cash only, and then there's going to be some places where things are a bit mixed. And then I have heard of areas where you can only basically pay with a card now. But when you're looking at some places in Europe, and again, not everywhere, a lot of train stations, like for example in Porto, if you want to use the bathroom at the train station there, you've got to pay 50 cents for that. At least as far as I remember, it's 50 cents. But different places may charge more, they may charge less. I paid, I think one time, €1. I forget where it was. It may have been in Italy. It could have been 50 cents. It doesn't even matter. But worthwhile holding on to coins. And I do recommend actually even carrying like a little coin purse with you. You can get them for pretty cheap. You can find them, say, for as cheap as like a couple of euros, but then you can find them for, I don't know, 40 euros. Depends on what you're looking for. But when in Europe, I definitely recommend holding on to your coins, because especially when you have denominations of 1 and 2 euro, it can add up quickly, the coins that are in your pocket, and they can actually be quite useful at the end of the day rather than just tossing them to the side. And so for some of these bathrooms where you would have to pay to get in, they might in some have an attendant where you pay after the fact, or they might have a machine where you have to pay before you go in. And I believe there's a couple in Venice, like just in the city, and not even attached to the train station, that I believe you do have to pay for, that are public. And they have an attendant there that'll be cleaning them, but still, just worthwhile keeping in mind if you've got to go and the only bathroom available to you is there and you have to pay for it and you don't have coins, that could be a big problem. But one thing that I sometimes would prefer to do, I'm not a big fan of public bathrooms. Nobody's a big fan of public bathrooms. But one thing that I would maybe be more likely to do, instead of, say, spending the 50 cents, maybe find like a coffee shop or a cafe, restaurant, something. Buy a little something, like say a bottle of water, juice, I don't know, a croissant, or in Portugal, pastel de nata and a coffee, and then maybe using the bathroom there. It's not going to work everywhere you go. I have been places where I bought the bottle of water, asked where the bathrooms were, and they said, oh no, we don't have bathrooms. And I was like, but I bought something, come on. But in general, I would be more likely to leave a train station, because train station bathrooms just, yeah, no, I'm not even going to go into it. But sometimes if you find like a decent cafe, their bathrooms will be better taken care of. And I'm not just saying that for here in Portugal, I'm saying that kind of as a generalization. But anyway, this is where I'm going to wrap it up for this week. So of course, a huge thank you to those of you who help to make these episodes possible on a monthly basis, as well as the one-time donations through the thanks button here on YouTube, as well as rafaeldefuria.com/support. But of course, the biggest thank you to those of you who help on the monthly basis to keep this project going through rafaeldefuria.com/support. Of course, I'm Rafael de Furia. This has been another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Stay safe and healthy out there, and I will see you all next time. Later.